Hi, I'm Jennifer Cabral, a graduate student in the Master of Information program at Rutgers University. I'm going to share some of the ideas I gathered by reading the book The Infinity of the Lists by Umberto Eco, and I'll start by explaining why I've chosen this particular title from all others that James Hodges suggested for us to read for his class, Knowledge and Society. In 2017, I attended a lecture by science historian Lorraine Daston, and during that lecture, I became fascinated with lists. She mentioned how logs of whaling ships in the Arctic from the 19th and early 20th centuries are now invaluable data for weather pattern research. Computer simulations have been generated from this early data, giving a new perspective of climate change. These ship logs were mere lists. They had fulfilled its purpose around the time they were created and could have easily been discarded or stored away without further use. But this is one of the aspects of infinity that lists can bring to us. Lists can be created with one intent. Lists can contain a certain number of elements, but depending on how you read a list, the possible correlations and sources of information they offer becomes literally infinite. So this is why I've chosen to read a book on lists. But why did Umberto Eco choose to write this book to begin with? So according to him, he had a long obsession with lists and often incorporated lists into his novels. So when in 2009 he was invited by the Louvre to organize a series of conferences, exhibitions, public readings, and film projections on a subject of his choice, he knew what he wanted to present. This book is a compendium of saints, plants, gods, countries, people, feelings, colors. These are lists in visual form and in literary form. There are a total of 1,003 lists in this book. So the book itself might feel infinite for some. Lists, many times fantastic in nature, were grabbed from classic literature and artworks from the Louvre's holdings in Paris. Just to give you a perspective, I was on a train to New York coincidentally during Comic-Con weekend, and a cartoonist literally pulled the book out of my hands to look at it. It is an irresistible feast to a visual person. By observing lists in various epochs of time, you can perceive the different lines of thought, such as the mythological views of the Greeks, the Christian obsession of the Dark Ages, the excesses of the Baroque period, the initial impulses of scientific thinking in the Renaissance, and the accumulation and consumption in the modern and postmodern eras. Umberto Eco tries not only to show how lists have been created and how they were presented throughout history, but he tries to explain why we resort to lists to explain the world around us. Although infinity is often associated with descriptions of quantities, such as the number of grains of sand on a beach and stars in the Milky Way, infinity can also include the properties belonging to one single item. This is often used when trying to define an object in its totality and expose all facets of one thing, all qualities of an object, as an attempt to give it form. When confronted with the task of representing something enormous and infinite, an artist can only create a form by describing multiple properties. In this process, a list is formed. Here's how Umberto Eco describes it. When something cannot be confined into form, it's ongoing and infinite. Such representation becomes a list or catalog. For Umberto Eco, there are two types of lists: practical lists and poetic lists. According to him, and I quote, "The practical list can be exemplified by a shopping list, the list of guests invited to a party, by a library catalog, by the inventory of objects in any place such as an office, an archive, or a museum, by the list of assets in a will, by an invoice for goods requiring payment, by a restaurant menu, by the list of sights to see in a tourist guide, and even by a dictionary that records all the words in the lexicon of a given language. These lists refer to objects that exist in the physical world and are being named and listed for a purpose. Because practical lists are records of known and defined objects, these lists are finite. The list refers not only to specific objects, but a defined number of them. These lists must be precise and accurate, such as the ship logs I've mentioned before, or the holdings of a museum. Although pragmatic lists can grow each year, like the growing stacks of a library or the number of items you have to pick up at the supermarket, these lists can only grow according to the material items in existence. Meanwhile, if the objects are fictitious and do not exist physically, a list can grow ad infinitum. And so a poetic list is always infinite according to Umberto Eco. Take, for example, the book The Aristotelian Telescope by Emmanuel Tesoro from 1665. So here's what this book presents under the category of small things. The angel who stands on a pinhead, incorporeal forms, the pole as the motionless point of the sphere, zenith and nadir, among elementary things, the spark of the fire, the drop of water, the scroop of stone, the grain on sand, the gem and the atom, among human things, the embryo, the arbutus, the pygmy and the dwarf, among the animals, the ant and the flea, among the plants, mustard seed and the breadcrumb, among the sciences, the mathematical point, in architecture, the tip of the pyramid. Umberto Eco also presents books as containers of infinite lists or devices for producing an infinite list of elements. And just like lists can seem incoherent, collections also carry incongruous tendencies because our concept of knowledge and art is so vast. These places allow for one space to contain objects that seem unrelated to one another. Such disordered accumulations allow the discovery of unexpected relations between the objects of knowledge. According to Eco, the hodgepodge is the price we pay not to attain completeness. Libraries support such quote-unquote disordered accumulations and establishes relationships with multiple fields of knowledge. The notational structure of the Dewey Decimal System is a list that acknowledges the presence of a book in multiple, if not infinite, categories. The lists of antiquity were created by authors who seem to rely on lists because they were overwhelmed and did not have words to describe their surroundings. The ineffable dominated the poetics of lists for many centuries. But in recent times, looking at authors such as James Joyce, it is clear that lists were not made for lack of words, but because of the excess of it. Streams of consciousness, the so-called interior monologues, so often found in literature as if emerging from a character, one after the other, and that the author is not always required to explain, are also presented as a form of lists. In modern times, there is a greed to use up as many words as possible, and a craving for the plural and unlimited. Throughout history, underneath each list, there is a wish for order and control, to grasping, capturing, and keeping knowledge, to understanding, explaining, and defining form. But starting in the 19th century, the list creates a sense of deformation and chaos. Parts of one element are aggregated to another as a collage. Eco describes the list becomes a way of reshuffling the world, to accumulate properties in order to bring out new relationships between distant things, and in many cases to cast doubt on those accepted by common sense. In this way, the chaotic list becomes one of the modes of that breakdown of form, set in motion in different ways by futurism, cubism, dadaism, surrealism, or by neorealism. So in the last century, the list is adopted for a different reason. According to Eco, the list in mass media is intended merely to suggest abundance, a need to satisfy the desire for the blockbuster, to show not only one glamorous image, but a great many of them, to provide the user with an inexhaustible reserve of voluptuous appeal, just as potentates of old adorn themselves with cascades of jewels, or as in certain American restaurants you pay a fixed price on entry and they can eat as much as you wish for a gigantic buffet. The technique of the list is not intended to cast doubt on any order in the world. On the contrary, its purpose is to reiterate that the universe of abundance and consumption available to all represents the only model of ordered society. This gives us a segue to the digital age. The same purpose of generating consumption can be observed in data and algorithms. These are the lists of the digital age. But except for a couple of paragraphs, the digital age is absent from Umberto Eco's exploration of lists. I hope you will use this gap on Umberto Eco's work to generate your own realizations and visualizations of how lists are represented and created in a digital context. Remember how ubiquitously lists permeate our social environment today. In the digital age, we are passively generating lists with our devices, and lists are being generated by us and for us. But there is another infinity of lists being created in the digital age I want to mention. There's a movement of looking back that is emerging. Projects such as the one mentioned by Lorraine Daston in the sciences are also sprouting in the humanities. Rereading and reinterpreting lists from the past is generating infinite data points and correlations that were not seen in the past. One example is the Digital Humanities project at Princeton University Mapping Expatriate Paris, which digitized and analyzed card catalogs from the iconic bookstore Shakespeare & Co. in Paris, and it is a view of the notorious community of writers that not even Woody Allen in his classic film Midnight in Paris was able to give. I highly recommend for you to check it out, and I'll put a link down below. This project is a good example of how lists that were once practical can become poetic. I hope this presentation inspires you to look at a list from different perspectives. What distinguishes a poetic list from a practical list is only the intention with which we contemplate it. According to Umberto Eco, a restaurant menu is a practical list, but in a book on culinary matters, a list of the diverse menus of the most renowned restaurants would already acquire a poetic value. I hope you enjoyed this feast of lists that Umberto Eco has given us. Thank you.